Sometimes we get caught up in the midst of the day-to-day of the activities and we don't step back and understand the bigger picture of what we're a part of. And one of the great blessings I've had with 40 Days, we never expected it to spread beyond our little town of College Station, Texas, let alone across the United States, let alone now internationally. 40 Days for Life has spread to 24 nations. Over 600,000 people have participated, 539 cities at last count. And one of the blessings I've had is being able to go now and visit some of these other nations to meet the faithful pro-lifers who are engaged in the same kinds of things that you and I are engaged in, sometimes speaking a different language, sometimes in very different dynamics, but at the same point with the same conviction to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves. And one thing that I have seen in every nation that I have visited is that they look to you and me for hope. And I mean that. Last week I got off the plane from a trip coming back from Spain, and my family had gone over mostly for vacation. We went to walk a portion of the Camino de Santiago, the Way of St. James, which I highly recommend to anybody if you haven't done this. But we walked 5 days, 72 miles, my 11-year-old son carrying a 15-pound backpack. I was so proud of my kids. But it was a beautiful spiritual experience. But while there, we also went to Madrid. And in Madrid, we've had numerous 40 Days for Life campaigns, so I was able to meet with our local leader, Frank Curis, who runs the 40 Days there, and a lot of their team, and get to spend time learning about the challenges and blessings of their 40 Days for Life campaigns. So while I was there and learning all about it, they were sharing how difficult it is. The church is largely asleep on this issue, much more so even than we experience here in the United States. They have a very difficult time getting people to come out. The Spanish culture just is not into activism or advocacy like you and I are a part of and we thrive on. But right during that visit with them, they had arranged for me to meet with a reporter from a large Spanish publication called Alpha y Omega, Alpha and Omega. And so when I was talking with the reporter, she was sharing with me, she said, David, you know, the pro-life movement in Spain, it's a major challenge and it's constantly depressing us. But she said, you know where we get our hope? We get our hope for what is happening in the United States of America right now. The progress that the pro-life movement is making. Earlier this year in January, I was asked at the last minute to go and speak at the French March for Life in Paris. And there were 45,000 Parisians packed into the streets there in Paris for that March for Life. It was so encouraging to see, and it was a very, very young audience, like what we see at the March for Life in Washington, D.C. But the man who was introducing me is telling this crowd, he says, the pro-life work that David is a part of in the United States is what gives hope to all of us as French people. Now, I was laughing to myself because I don't even speak one word of French. Fortunately, they had a translator. But I hear this everywhere I go. I was in London a year ago, and I was walking through the streets with a group of our 40 Days for Life volunteers, and there was a prominent journalist who was walking with us. And she turned to me, pulled me away from the rest of the group so nobody else would overhear, and she said, you know, David, we British are a very proud people. And I said, really? I would never have guessed that. And she said, we would never, ever admit this publicly, but we look to the United States for our leadership. She says, if you want to know the greatest gift that you can give the rest of the world, end abortion in America, and the rest of the world will follow. That was her message. And you know, I honestly believe that. I believe we have a unique duty, obligation, responsibility to end this injustice that much of the rest of the world has been inflicted upon because of what happened here in the United States. Because of Roe versus Wade and Doe versus Bolton and all the subsequent things where America has pushed abortion out to the world. We have a responsibility. But we are providing hope. The pro-life movement is gaining steam. More and more people are self-identifying as pro-life. The latest polling shows 14-point majority of those who identify as pro-life versus those who identify as pro-choice. Abortion facilities are closing in record numbers. Last year, 84 abortion clinics closed across America, the most in any year since Roe versus Wade. We see record numbers of pregnancy centers opening their doors to offer hope and help rather than the sales pitch for an abortion that somebody would get at a Planned Parenthood or an independent abortion mill. We see young people getting more involved in this movement because your generation realizes we're not the future of the pro-life movement. We are the pro-life movement. It is our generation that are survivors. 1 out of 3 of my peers did not make it out of the womb. I have an obligation to do everything I can to right this injustice that my parents' generation inflicted upon us. And you're doing it. And that is providing hope all around the world. But there are two messages I hope to get across during our time together today about what it will take for us to not only continue to provide that hope, but for us to do what that journalist said, to end this injustice of abortion in America so the rest of the world will follow. The first message is we need to understand exactly what it is that we are facing. And you're doing that today. Through your Face the Truth efforts, you are exposing people to the brutal reality of what is happening through abortion to the child. We also now have the testimonies of women who've been wounded by abortion, and as they share their testimonies about how they've been affected physically, emotionally, psychologically, spiritually, we know that abortion doesn't help women, it hurts women. But we need to even realize that all of those things are worldly symptoms of a much deeper problem. It's a spiritual problem. And when I finally came to the realization of what we were up against, for it to become real for me, was in 2004. And we were in the middle of the first ever 40 Days for Life campaign in Texas, just a local campaign. And we were so busy doing prayer vigils and standing outside the abortion clinic, and we had people going door to door spreading the pro-life message, and I barely slept during those 40 days, let alone having time to go out of town and do anything else. But I'd made one previous commitment before the 40 days to go and speak for a pregnancy center in Michigan. And so the day came, and I handed off the 40 Days for Life campaign to Sean and Mary Lisa Carney, a young couple that was working for me. And they were running it, so I got on the plane and I flew that day into Grand Rapids, Michigan. And when I landed at the airport, the gentleman who was going to be the host for the day, his name's Jim Sprague, he runs the Pregnancy Resource Center. I was there to speak for their fundraising banquet that night. Jim picks me up at the airport. It's early afternoon. He says, David, it's early. We've got two options of what we can do right now. Option one is I can take you to a hotel. And you can just freshen up, you can rest for a little bit, you can just prepare yourself for tonight. Or option two is I can take you to show you something that will forever change your life. What do you want to do? Now, I don't know about you. I don't think that's a fair choice. I looked at Jim and I said, of course I'm going to have to pick what's behind door number two. I have to do the life-changing thing. And I'm thinking, yeah, right, we'll see about that. Yeah, I saw about that. So Jim drove me from the airport into downtown Grand Rapids. And we started going through the different one-way streets in the city in between all the tall buildings until we turned onto the street that held our destination. Ransom Avenue was the name of the street. And we pulled up in front of the building where we were going. Number 72, Ransom Avenue. And as we pulled up and parked right in front of it, Jim said, David, we're going to go in. You're going to meet the brand new owners of 72 Ransom. They literally just took ownership of this building 5 days ago. And they're going to tell you about this place, but brace yourself, this is going to be intense. So we got out of the car and we walked up and opened the two wooden doors. And I looked at this building and it looked like a big old church building, but there was no cross on it. And we walked in the doors and we met the new owners. And they proceeded to tell me the history of 72 Ransom. You see, this building was originally built in the late 1800s. And the reason it looked like a church building was because it had been built originally as a house of worship. It was originally built as a Jewish synagogue. And for years, that congregation assembled and grew inside 72 Ransom, and they worshiped God, the author of life, the creator of the universe. They held weddings, they held funerals in that place. It was a place that honored God. But over time, that congregation grew. And they outgrew 72 Ransom, so they said, well, we've got to sell, we've got to move a little out of town, we've got to build a bigger synagogue. And so they did. And they sold the building, this time to a Greek Orthodox congregation. So the Greek Orthodox congregation came in and they began to fill the pews. They began to sing in the church. They began to bring life into this place. Again, honoring God, honoring His creation. And for years they met in that building. But over time their congregation also outgrew 72 Ransom, and it was time for them to move and sell the building. So when they put the building on the market, some enterprising business people looked at it and said, well, why would we waste this prime real estate in downtown on something as worthless as a church? That was their view. So let's turn it into commercial real estate. So they bought 72 Ransom and they decided to lease it to the highest bidder. And the highest bidder that decided to move in was a notorious Western Michigan abortionist. And this church building that from the late 1800s until 1996 had been a church was converted into the largest abortion facility in Western Michigan. During those next few years, they know that he did over 30,000 abortions inside the walls of that former church building, only because when he eventually left, he had not kept his records confidential and private like he was supposed to, and they found documentation of over 30,000 abortions. There were probably more. But when he took over that building and he began to spill the blood of innocent children, began to wound women, the Christian community began to pray. Because people said this was a house of God. This was a place that honored His creation, life knit together in a mother's womb in His image and likeness, and it's being used to destroy that very gift. And they began to pray. And a group of people started to get together and said, we need to meet monthly and we need to pray about this. We need to pray for God to reclaim this building that was once His. And so they started to get together, and some local business people joined the group. And for the next couple of years they prayed, and finally in 1999 they thought their prayers had been answered because a for sale sign went up outside of 72 Ransom. So they went in behind the scenes and tried to make an offer to buy the building, and it failed. They tried to make another offer a different way, and it failed. Objection, challenge, problem after problem. They ran into all of these obstacles and all of these problems literally from 1999 until 2004 for the next 5 years. Nothing was working, and all they could do was pray as the death toll kept going up. But finally in 2004, the owners were done with it. They were ready to sell. And the local group of Christian business people put together a ridiculously overinflated offer, and they reached out and they were willing to sell the building. So when those Christian business people took ownership, they did two things. The first thing was they kicked the abortionist out of the building and they shut down that deadly practice. And the second thing they did is they deeded 72 Ransom over to a new ministry which had just been formed in Grand Rapids called Life International. And Life International was formed by a former pregnancy center director who said everywhere that abortion rears its ugly head around the world, we need to plant Christian pregnancy centers in all of those communities. And so that was the ministry that it was given this former abortion facility which had previously been a church. So the people I was meeting there in the entryway were the directors of Life International. They were the ones telling me this story. And they said, David, up until 5 days ago, abortions were still happening here. Most things still look almost the way they were. Would you be willing to take a tour? I was nervous, but I said yes. So we were standing in the entryway, and there were stairs going up and stairs going down, and they explained that when girls came in, frequently they would have a friend or a family member or boyfriend or somebody else with them. And what the abortion staff was trained to do was separate the girl from that support person, because they knew if that person is with her, they could talk her out of the abortion. That could cost us $700, $800, $1,000 or more. So they'd send the support person upstairs, they'd send the girl downstairs. And she would go into the first room on the right, which they opened the door, and it was a waiting room. And there were nice leather chairs and wallpaper and nice wall decorations, a very nice, typical waiting room. And there was a window there, and they described to me that the girl would go in. She would go to the window and get her clipboard, and then she would go sit on one of those chairs. Tears rolling down her cheek, but not wanting to admit to anybody else that she didn't want to be there, because there were other women lining the walls, also waiting for their abortions. And what they didn't know is what was right behind the wall they were sitting up against. And they took me to the next room. And when they opened that door, years earlier, the ceiling of this room had collapsed from water damage. They had never cleaned it up. So the stench of rot and mildew hit me in the face, and cockroaches were scattered all over that room. Now, literally, that was less than a foot away through the wall from where these young women were waiting for their so-called safe and legal abortions. Then they took me to the third room in the hall. And that was the room where the abortions were performed. And when we walked in, there were some things that had been removed. For example, the surgical table had been taken out by the abortionist when he left. But on the floor, you could still see a dried rectangle of rust and blood, because they had never cleaned around the base of that table. On the wall where the suction machine had been, there was mold on the wall. There were unsterilized, rusty surgical tools on the counter that had never been cleaned. But what struck me the most in that room, as I looked at the hard linoleum floor, there was this indention worn in, this arc worn into the linoleum. And I asked my hosts, I said, what is this? And they said, that is where the abortionist stood at the base of the table, moving back and forth, ripping those tiny legs and arms off of those children. 30,000 of them. And when I saw that, that was when, for me, this issue became real. It's not just a political debate. It's not just something we talk about on Sanctity of Human Life Sunday. I realized that this is a matter of life and death. Then they took me to the final room. And in that room, it was the waiting room after the abortions were performed. No nice wall decorations or wallpaper or nice padded leather chairs. A few moth-eaten, plaid, stained, stinky couches where they would just dump the woman, give her a cup of juice and a cookie until she got up enough strength on her own to go back out onto the street. That was abortion. I was looking at all this thinking this was just stunning, and I couldn't believe it. But what I really couldn't believe is what they shared with me next. An experience they'd had 5 days earlier, the day they took ownership of 72 Ransom. As you can imagine, the directors of Life International wanted to get everybody they knew to come and pray over this building, to pray to cleanse it of what had happened there, and to pray for God to reclaim it. So they got everybody they could. Carol Everett, former abortion provider who had a conversion, evangelical Christian today, she was in town. She came, pastors, ministry leaders, and they all gathered inside the church, and they said, we need to pray. Where do we need to start? And one person said, well, where do the abortionists start every day? Let's start our prayers there. So they went down those stairs, past those rooms I described to you, down to the end of the hall, which hooked to the right, and there was a big metal door that opened up into the alley outside where the abortionist would park his car and come in the morning and begin his deadly business. Well, the door was closed and latched, but they gathered inside that entryway there, right inside the door, and they prayed. And they prayed for a long time, very fervently, and begging God to reclaim this place. And when they reached the end of that time of prayer, one of the pastors said, Amen. And at that moment, that big metal door on its own burst open and swung out and clanged against the stones in the alleyway, and they felt a rush of air go out of the building. A few seconds later, they felt a gentle breeze come right back in. Now, they were surprised, to say the least. And everybody just was speechless, and they clambered back upstairs into the entryway, just standing around thinking, what did we just experience? And a woman came in off the street. She pulled one of the Life International volunteers aside and she said, I just had to come ask you, what happened to your statue? And they said, I'm sorry, what are you talking about? And she said, well, I live around here. I walk by here every day. And for years you've had perched on the roof of that building the statue of that big demon figure, a big, strong, muscular demon figure perched on the roof of the building. It's been there for years. It's gone today. What did you do with it? There had never been a statue. But looking into her eyes, they could tell she had previously seen something that she was not seeing that day. They said, David, what we believe we experienced a few days ago while I was there was a spiritual transfer of ownership of 72 Ransom Avenue. And I believe that is what they experienced. And I believe that's what we need to experience in our America. One nation under God. And look how far we have fallen from that ideal. That which is immoral and unholy is celebrated. That which is right and righteous is called bigotry, hatred, hate speech. How far we have come. How far we need to go. We need a spiritual transfer of ownership in America. And the way that God will accomplish that, He could snap His fingers and abortion could end tomorrow. But He's waiting on something. He's waiting on you and me. And that's my second point, is to realize the urgency that you and I have of acting, and acting today. Why today? Well, I mentioned I was at a funeral this morning. This past Sunday, we had just gotten home from our trip, and we got word that a friend, a family that we know very well from our church, the young mother who's pregnant, got stung by yellow jackets. And she was allergic. And she went into anaphylactic shock, which triggered a brain aneurysm. Within 24 hours, 32-year-old Sarah Harkins and her 20-week unborn baby died on Monday. Her husband was the one who came out to try to resuscitate her. A young dad. 4 young children at home, including a Down syndrome baby who's a year old. Can you imagine the burden that Eric is carrying on his shoulders? The funeral this morning was packed, and it was beautiful. And the priest, Father Cummings, who gave the homily, said, this isn't how it's supposed to happen. But God's ways are different than our ways. And he reminded us that before God led us in a situation where we would feel the pain of losing a loved one, He Himself did that first. By allowing His Son to die on a cross and lose His life, His only Son, for us. And as I was reflecting on this over these last few days, on this life cut short of this beautiful young mother, I realized that all of us are not promised anything more than today. We can't change our past, regardless of what we've done right or what we've done wrong. We can ask forgiveness for it, but we can't change it. The past is past. We are not promised tomorrow. And when we have something like this, it really hits us, the reality. That's not just rhetoric. None of us are promised anything beyond this moment, today. And this day is a gift that we have been given by God. I think that's why the word we use for this moment is present, because it truly is a gift from God. And what I hope I can convey to you is, with the scope of what we are facing, this spiritual crisis, with the reality that we are providing hope to the world, you and I have to look in the mirror and we have to say, I cannot put off until tomorrow that which I can do today. Yes, you've been out on the streets, and many of you are going to go back out there for a few more hours today, and I commend you for that. Many of you have been involved. I'm preaching to the choir here. You've been involved in pro-life work, and you say, okay, David, I'm already doing it. But each of us, I believe, can do more than we have been doing. Will it be easy? No. Will it be scary? Yes. But do we need to do it, and do we need to do it today? I believe without question, because we don't know what the future will hold. The whole story of 40 Days for Life is because of people all across the country and around the world who decided to not wait till tomorrow, but instead to do something today, to meet the problem that is right in their community, the same thing that you're doing. When 40 Days for Life began, it was myself, Sean and Mary Lisa Carney, and a young woman, and we were frustrated because children were dying in our town at the Planned Parenthood abortion facility by the hundreds every year. And we felt helpless. We felt that we couldn't do anything to stop this. And out of desperation, we prayed for 1 hour and said, God, show us what we can do to change this. Use us. Let us be your hands and your feet. Now, I warn you, when you pray those kinds of prayers, be careful, because He might actually tell you what you need to do. And the problem was, during that hour of prayer, He told us. And we were scared. We realized that we needed to pray and fast, because this is a spiritual struggle, and we have to meet it first and foremost with spiritual weapons. We realized that we needed to go to the place where lives were being lost outside of the abortion facility and be there for 40 days, 12, 24 hours a day if necessary, to be there offering hope to the mothers, offering help to everybody going in, bearing witness to the entire community about the injustice that was happening inside, and also to spread this word to everybody we could throughout our community through community outreach. Knocking on doors, going to churches, speaking in schools, holding signs on the side of the road, whatever it took. But when we finished that hour of prayer, I can't speak for the other 3 people who were praying with me. I did not want to do this. I was scared. I didn't think we could succeed at it. I didn't know if it would work. I didn't know what people would think. I thought people would laugh at us. I thought it would be tough. I thought we were setting ourselves up to fail. But what if we had just said, well, let's put that in a file cabinet for some other time? Fortunately, I was surrounded by faith-filled people, and they said, let's do it. And 2 weeks from that day, the first 40 Days for Life campaign kicked off. And that year, abortions were reduced in that community by 28%. Over 100 children were spared from abortion because people didn't wait. They did it today. Well, over the next few years, we thought that was the end of 40 Days for Life. As Jack mentioned, I moved up to this area from Texas to Virginia and went to work at American Life League. Thought that 40 Days for Life, we checked that box, that was done. But it kept spreading on its own. One by one, other cities began to replicate 40 days of prayer and fasting, 40 days of vigil, 40 days of outreach, and they saw similar results. So finally, we decided, well, maybe we should join God in what He's doing. Maybe we should organize a 40 Days for Life campaign. And wow, wouldn't it be awesome if like a dozen cities did this at one time? That was how small our vision was. So we decided to do this. But something kind of threw a kink in it at the last second. Somebody threw a kink in it in the last second. He's somebody that Jack has coming to speak here next month. A young man named Eric Scheidler. Now, Joe and Ann Scheidler I've known for years. They're my heroes. I'm in the pro-life movement full-time because Joe convinced me to do that. But Eric, their son, called me up as we were gearing up for this first 40 Days for Life, thinking, a dozen cities would join up. And Eric said, David, I'm going to get my mom, Ann, on, and we need to talk to you. We just found out that in the suburb of Chicago, Aurora, Illinois, Planned Parenthood was on the sly building a massive abortion facility, and they lied to the community. They put up a sign said, coming soon, Gemini Healthcare. They filed their permits to the city under a false identity, but we just found out one of the contractors said, something looks really fishy here. They investigated. Planned Parenthood's building this massive abortion center here. It opens in 43 days. Eric says to me, David, can we organize a 40 Days for Life in 3 days? Now, any of you have run a 40 Days for Life? Where's Jody? It's difficult enough with weeks or months of preparation. But 3 days. Now in the back of my mind I'm thinking, there's no way. But I remembered and I said, okay, Eric, with God all things are possible. Sure, yes, you could do it. Now that night they decided to call people together to plan and try to kick this thing off. And they scheduled a meeting at a local church in the basement. But that night, as the meeting, it was about time for the meeting, started massive thunderstorms, lightning everywhere, and Eric said, it's off. Nobody's going to come. Here we were trying to kick this thing off. He pulls up at the church, and the parking lot is packed. There were over 80 people in this little bitty room down in the basement, and they were all fired up, and they said, we need to do it. 3 days later, they kicked off that 40 Days for Life. At times, they had 2,300 people outside of that site where Planned Parenthood was building the abortion facility. Planned Parenthood didn't even know that they were going to help us, because they decided to label this ground zero of the abortion debate, and they flew in all the national media to come in. And they said, we will open that facility on day 40. Well, Eric and Joe called me up and said, well, would you come out here? We're going to do a rally on the night of day 39 to just tell our people, okay, it's opening, but at least we need to press on in this work. We need to do other things. So I flew into Chicago. And they picked me up and they said, well, the final hearing, Planned Parenthood is demanding an injunction so they can get into the building tomorrow. The final hearing's happening at the courthouse in downtown Chicago. So they drove me into downtown Chicago. We go into the courtroom, and praise be to God, the judge hears the case and decides, no, I am not going to let Planned Parenthood in. And on day 40, they did not open their abortion facility in Aurora, Illinois. So that night, instead of having a rally to pep people up, we were having a celebration, Praise Jesus rally. It was awesome. And that night afterwards, Eric and a bunch of us, we went out to the site with this still not open abortion facility at that time. And I was talking to some of the people, and they said, you know, it's amazing. For 40 days, we prayed this place wouldn't open today. And when it failed to open, we were surprised. Oh, us of little faith. We pray for something, and then when God answers, we're surprised. Well, regrettably, 13 days later, they kept up their vigil 24 hours a day. Regretfully, that facility did open. But number one, there were 2 weeks they were not able to kill a single child in there. And number two, their business has never been up to the estimates of what they had wanted to be their flagship Chicagoland area abortion facility. And so we know the attention that was brought to that definitely helped to save many other lives. And through the national media coverage that Planned Parenthood graced us with, 40 Days for Life kicked off nationally our first campaign, not in a dozen cities, but 89 cities signed up to join us in that first 40 Days for Life, thanks to the abortion industry. So Eric didn't wait. He didn't put off to tomorrow. He said, I've got to do it today, right where I live. It's not what's happening in Washington, D.C. It's not what's happening, in his case, in Springfield, in the state capital. It's what can I do where I live right now? And he did, and lives were saved. What about Devaney Cooper? Devaney was a homeschooled high school student in Memphis, Tennessee. She heard about 40 Days for Life, and she said, wow, this is really cool. So she went to all the pro-life experts in town, all the organizations, and they all said, oh, Devaney, how naive you are. That would never work here. We can't get people to come out and pray once a month at the abortion facility, and you're saying every day out there? Oh, that's really cute, Devaney, but no, this won't work here. Well, Devaney, she didn't even have a driver's license, but her mom agrees to help her. Devaney says, well, nobody else will do it. I'll sign up. So Devaney signs up to lead the 40 Days for Life campaign. So she puts a little team of people together. They start organizing meetings. They start announcing their plans to the community. We're going to hold our 40 Days for Life outside a downtown Memphis office building because Planned Parenthood has the third floor. That's where their abortion facility is, in this rented office space in downtown. So as they're announcing this news, all of a sudden they get a nasty letter. And the nasty letter is from the owner of that building who is leasing the space to Planned Parenthood. And he says, Dear Devaney Cooper, I just wanted to let you know that I'm aware of your plans to do this 40 Days for Life, and I want you to know that this is a cease and desist order. If you do this, it will cause financial duress to all of my other tenants, and there are other abortion facilities in town that are not in my building. Go move your 40 Days for Life somewhere else or cancel it, or I will sue you, homeschooled student. I will sue your whole team, and while we're at it, we'll sue the National 40 Days for Life organization. So that night, we got on the phone with Tom Brecka, heroic lawyer at the Thomas More Society in Chicago. And Devaney and her team are all on a speaker, and Tom's on there. If you've ever met Tom, he's this feisty guy, and he's ready to take it all right to the mats. Let's go. Let's fight him. And we get done with this call. Tom gets off, and I say, well, Devaney, what are you guys going to do? She says, well, clearly our plans are already having an effect or they wouldn't do this. We need to ramp up our campaign. We need to do even more. And so our team worked harder. They got more volunteers. They had over 400 people get their campaign kicked off when it started. And during those 40 days, the lawsuit was heating up. And Tom called me up and said, I think it'd be good for you to fly in, go in and pep up the troops, and you need to challenge this guy publicly, and if we need to, we'll do a press conference. So I flew into Memphis, mid-campaign. And when I arrived to get my rental car, I drive out to the site, I pull behind the building, I park, and my cell phone rings, and I answer it. And it's Tom Bereit, and Tom's laughing. He says, David, I explained to the attorneys for this business, this building, that I've argued free speech pro-life cases to the U.S. Supreme Court 3 times and won every single time, and that I'm representing you guys for free and they're going to pay a lot of money for their attorneys. And I said, bring it on. And he said, amazingly, they decided to back down and drop the lawsuit. So not only did they drop the lawsuit, that campaign was a huge success. 12 lives were saved that they know of through those 40 days. And here's the rest of the story. The next year, Planned Parenthood's lease came up for renewal. The business owner said, they are not worth all this trouble. And he shut them down and kicked them out of the building. And again, it was because one young girl, a homeschool high school student, said, I'm not going to wait till tomorrow. I'm not promised tomorrow. I'm going to do what I can today. And she fought. Lives were saved in her city. Brian Westbrook in St. Louis, Missouri. Missouri now only has 1 abortion facility. They're one of the few states. That number is growing yearly. It's exciting. Columbia, Missouri had a Planned Parenthood abortion facility. They did 40 Days for Life campaigns and then a constant prayer presence and sidewalk counseling. For 20 months, Planned Parenthood couldn't replace abortionists fast enough, and eventually they lost their abortion license because they weren't able to do any abortions. So St. Louis is it. It's a massive Planned Parenthood in downtown. Young dad named Brian Westbrook, he was an engineer. He saw this problem and said, we need to do something. He'd not been involved in pro-life, but he said, we need to do something. Let's do a 40 Days for Life. So he signed up. Now, he was a young dad. He was just new, fairly recently married. He was working full-time, but he said, I'm going to lead a 40 Days for Life. And their first campaign was a really big success. And then they did another one. And by 2011, their biggest 40 Days for Life campaign, they had almost 2,000 people participate, and they saved 15 lives during that campaign. It was a huge success that most of us would say, wow, you've reached the pinnacle of success. But Brian looked at all of those women and all of those children continuing to go into that facility and said, we're not doing enough. So Brian called me. He called a few others. And he said, I need to do more. So Brian quit his job and started up a full-time pro-life organization on faith. They would do not only 40 Days for Life, but a constant prayer presence and education and partner with the pregnancy centers and constant sidewalk counseling. That next year of 2012, midway through the year when they started this off, they saw 168 lives saved. And last year, their first full year of doing this year-round, 370 babies were spared from abortion at that last abortion facility. And Planned Parenthood in the state of Missouri have just come out announcing that the abortion numbers are dropping like a rock in that state. Again, somebody had the faith and said, I'm not going to wait for tomorrow. I'm going to do what I can today. I could tell you many, many more stories, and I know time does not permit. But the same holds true for each of us here today. For you. You've heard some of my stories, but your story is one that I can't tell. Your story is one that I can't live. You need to tell your story. There are some lives that only you can save. There are some mothers that only you can reach in a time of crisis. There are some people who need healing that only you can connect with and help them to begin that journey to healing. There are some laws that only you can pass. There are some ministries that only you can start or organizations you can take to the next level. Somewhere somebody needs to hear your story. Do you ever think about this? You may be the only Bible some people ever read. You may be the only church that some people ever experience. You can make a huge difference. I don't know what it is you're supposed to do, but deep in your heart, and as you pray and ask God, I think He will show you what you need to do. And my prayer is that when He does, you don't say, oh, tomorrow, or never, or I don't want to do that, or I don't think I can do that, or I'm scared, or what about get her to do it? She'd be so much better. What about that guy? He could do that. I hope you'll have the faith to say, yes, as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. And that you will step up and do what you have been called to do. To pray, to fast, to educate yourself, to educate others, to be willing to be ridiculed, to be willing to be challenged, to be willing to reach out and offer help to people in a time of need, to volunteer at a pregnancy center, to help with a parish or church pro-life activity, to help with political campaigns. Maybe it's to help get good people elected, maybe it's to help to get bad people out of office, to get good laws passed, or maybe somebody in here, God is asking you to run for political office. And you say, oh, David, this is Maryland, you know. That's really an ugly business. And my answer to that is yes. And that darkness needs some light. Do we need more good, God-fearing men and women in our political system in Maryland? Maybe you're the one that God is calling to do that. Maybe you have a friend or family member who's been through an abortion, and you can extend the loving forgiveness that our Savior Jesus Christ offers to all of us as sinners, and help somebody find healing through a Project Rachel program or Forgiven and Set Free Bible study. Help somebody begin that journey to their own healing so then they can offer that hope and help to somebody else. You young people, you may this week, this month, be around somebody who is at risk of having an abortion. Somebody in a crisis who doesn't know where to turn. There was a study that Students for Life announced a couple of years ago at their conference which stunned me. They found that of those who had had abortions, 82% said that if one person had offered to help them through their pregnancy, they wouldn't have had the abortion. One. And that may be you, helping one person in your church, in your school, in your neighborhood. I don't know what it is. Maybe it's to defend life with Jack by helping to sponsor these speakers. Maybe it's to donate to your local pro-life organizations. I don't know what it is that God is asking you to do, but I pray that you will dig deep, find what that is, and do it. My last two thoughts to wrap this up. Number one, is it going to be easy? No. In fact, if it's easy for you, I'm going to feel cheated because it hasn't been easy for me. This is the toughest thing I've ever done. It's outside of my comfort zone. Pro-life work doesn't seem to fit my temperament, but God has a great sense of humor. And here I am. But you know what? We do what we've got to do. Even when we face, people are going to reject you. Did you have anybody this morning give you that one-finger salute as they drove by? Anybody see that? You know what they're telling you? They are not telling you their IQ. That's not what it is. They're pointing the way to heaven for you, telling you you're number one. That's what it is. We're going to be ridiculed. We're going to have people reject us. There's going to be strains in family. You may have people unfriend you or unfollow you on social media. I'm sorry. I'll tell you my worst. My worst experience was a couple of summers ago. We went to visit all our 40 Days for Life campaigns in Australia. And they flew us over, and they took us all over the country of Australia. So we were all over the East Coast, West Coast, South, Adelaide, down in Tasmania. It was an amazing experience. Faithful people there. And again, a very oppressive environment. And they were telling us how the U.S. is providing them hope. So our last full night in Australia, we're in Sydney. And I was asked that night to speak for the New South Wales Right to Life, their fundraising banquet. And they have all these people. It's like 300 or 400 people in there. And they have all these members of Parliament. Everybody's in nice suits and looking really fancy. And so right as the doctor who's introducing me to get up, he introduces me. And as I start walking up, a woman in the back jumps up shrieking. And she says, "This is for all the women." And she pulls up this pink, sparkly ballet shoe. And she hurls it at me. Now, she later told the Sydney newspaper she was inspired by the reporter who threw the shoe at former President George W. Bush in Iraq just to show disgust for him, and we've seen that happen to other political figures since. And this was her way of saying, "I'm disgusted with you." And that was her cue when she threw the shoe, which, by the way, she missed me by a mile, so I was safe. You don't have to worry. But that was the cue, and all these other, 15 other people came storming into the room from out in the hall, and they all started chanting obscenities, and they started sprinkling glitter on people. They started handing out pictures of Mary and baby Jesus saying that abortion is a sacred right, and they started yelling, and they ran up to the front, and they locked their arms across the front of this room. Now, I was a little surprised. I've been through a lot in this movement. That caught me off guard, I have to be honest. My kids are sitting right here on the front row, and they're looking at all this, and they're looking at me like, "Okay, Dad, what's going to happen next?" All I could think to do was pray. And so I just grabbed the mic, their little megaphone they brought in. The battery must have died. What a shame. It didn't work. So I grabbed the microphone, and I just said, "Well, everybody, please join me in praying the Lord's Prayer." And we all joined hands, and we prayed the Lord's Prayer, and then we went on to pray for those who've been affected by abortion, those who've been hurt by abortion. Because when I looked at these people's eyes, these young people, as they were yelling, they were angry. And there was hurt in their eyes. I don't know their story. I don't know if some of them have had an abortion or are still carrying that pain. Maybe they lost a child. Maybe they know somebody who had an abortion, but there was pain there. And we prayed for them. Now, eventually the security came in and they were able to disperse this, and then when the evening went on, and the Sydney pro-lifers were more fired up than ever. It was great. But afterwards, I was talking with my children about this. And I said, living out our Christian faith, living out this pro-life commitment, it's not supposed to be easy. In fact, in Scripture, we're promised that it won't be easy. If we're not getting some pushback, we're not doing enough. And I pointed them to the Gospel of Matthew that says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." So when somebody is giving you that one-finger salute, when somebody is yelling at you, they're criticizing you, when somebody's telling you, your idea, that's stupid, that will never work, and you do it anyway, you're storing up treasures in heaven. So it's going to be hard. But my last message, my last thought is simply, it's going to be worth it. It's going to be worth it. One experience that showed me this so profoundly, when my family had just first moved to Virginia, I had been speaking all over the place and traveling around the country and going and giving pro-life talks. And this was even before we got 40 Days for Life kicked off. But it was the end of a fall season and I was just wiped out tired. I had one more talk left just outside of Philadelphia in Chester County, Pennsylvania. And it was the night before and I was sitting on the couch with my wife and I said to her, I don't want to leave. I don't want to leave you and the kids. I don't want to be gone anymore. I am so tired. I go and give these talks and I don't even know if anybody's listening. And she looked at me and she said, "David, you made a commitment. And this is what we're supposed to do. So go do it." And I knew I had to. So the next morning I got on the plane, flew, got there, went to the event. And that night at the event, I gave my pro-life talk. Woo! Hope I'll get excited, go do something, change the world. And afterwards, the room was clearing out and people were leaving. And a young man came up to me in a very expensive suit. And he unbuttons the suit and pulls something out of his pocket. And he says, "Mr. Bereit, can I borrow your ear for just a minute?" I said, "Okay." He hands me the picture and he says, "Do you know what this is?" And I looked down and I said, "Well, yeah, that's an ultrasound picture." He says, "Yep." He says, "Can you identify what's going on in that ultrasound specifically?" I looked at it, and if you've seen some of the older, particularly black and white ultrasounds, I couldn't really make much out. I said, "I'm not really sure." He says, "There's a reason for that." He said, "Because there's 4 in there." He said, "My wife is pregnant right now with quadruplets." He said, "When our doctor found out, he said, 'Oh, that's just too much risk. You need to either do one of 2 things. You need to either have a selective reduction, abort a few so the others have a better chance, or you need to just abort this entire pregnancy and start all over again.'" He said, she didn't want to do that. She said, "That's insane." He said, "But I listened. This was a doctor after all. He was an expert. And family and other people started telling us the same thing. Well, you need to think about your wife. You need to think about the one child that could survive this." And he said, "I began to put the pressure on her." And he says, "And we are scheduled right now for an abortion for these 4 children." He said, "I came here tonight because I owed a friend a favor." And he said, "I need somebody at my table." I didn't fill it. At the last second he called me. He said, "Believe me, I did not want to come here." He said, "But I walked in and I heard the stories you shared and I looked around at all of these pro-life people who were there giving money, giving their time, giving everything to help children they may never even meet." And he said, "I asked myself, how can I do anything less for my own flesh and blood?" He said, "You may wonder as you travel around if these talks make any difference." He said, "I don't know if it does for anybody else. But for this dad and for his 4 children, it made all the difference." I went home that night. I called my wife from the hotel room. And I was bawling like a baby. And she said, "See, I told you needed to go." I went back home. And a few months later, I get an email from somebody I don't know. And it has an attachment. And what are you supposed to do with an email that has an attachment from somebody you don't know? You're not supposed to open it. But for some reason, I just knew I was supposed to do something. And I double-clicked that little attachment. And it was a picture that popped open. And it was those 4 little baby girls sitting in their mommy and daddy's beds. It was right before Easter. They were dressed in pink bunny suits. And as I looked at that picture, I thought, what if I hadn't gone and done what I needed to do that day? What if those people hadn't been involved in pro-life efforts in that community that day? Those children would not be alive. So no matter how hard it is, know that it's worth it. And as we realize that this is a spiritual crisis, that we need to respond first with a spiritual solution, and we need to recognize we are not promised tomorrow, we only have today, we need to do everything we possibly can to save lives, to speak up for those who cannot speak for themselves, and to turn the tide back in our nation so it truly will experience a spiritual transfer of ownership, and once again will be one nation under God. God bless you.